Good morning, everyone. This week we are talking about biological and biosocial theory. So we're going to begin with talking about biological positivism. We are looking at the biological and biosocial theories of crime in this chapter, in this module. These theories trace back to the positivist tradition, which emphasized that human behavior is shaped by forces outside of free will. In criminology, that meant looking at how heredity, body type, and physiology might influence offending. And remember, last week we were talking about rational choice, and that is the free will. So while many early theories were overly deterministic and flawed within the biological theories, modern biosocial criminology integrates biological predispositions with the social environment. Now, the key idea here is that biology does matter, but it doesn't operate in isolation, so it interacts with the context. The first well-known figure in biological theory is Cesare Lombroso, and he argued that criminals were evolutionary throwbacks, that we were born criminals who could be identified by physical stigmata such as a sloping forehead, a protruding jaw. And while his work brought science into criminology, it was methodologically weak and biased. Charles Going, he later rejected Lombroso's stigmata, but still suggested that hereditary defects such as low intelligence might be linked to crime. Ernest Houghton and later William Sheldon, they connected body type to criminal behavior. Sheldon's somatypes argued that metamorphs who are muscular and aggressive were most crime prone. Now, these classic theories gave us a framework for thinking biologically, but they were really too simplistic, and they often ignored environmental influences, and then we have a risk of stereotyping. And Houghton's work really totally discredited due to the research using policemen and firemen who were actually recruited for their jobs due to physical attributes. By the 1950s, the biological theory was really totally discredited. It never really took hold in America because our criminology was really dominated by sociologists. But what does Rain report on biology? You weren't required to read these chapters. I'm just going to give you some information on what Rain thought about biological theory. Rain presents a powerful case for understanding crime as the product of biosocial interaction. Biological vulnerabilities, whether in your brain structures, your genes, or your physiology, can create these predispositions. But it is environment from childhood experiences to social structures that determines whether those predispositions result in crime. Now, Rain also found that the key takeaway is balance. Biology matters, but it does not dictate the destiny. Rain's neurocriminology provides us with tools to better understand offenders, but it also challenges us to think carefully about policy, ethics, and responsibility. Now, he begins by highlighting the biological foundations of violent behavior. The prefrontal cortex, which we will talk about, this is what is responsible for decision-making and impulse control, is often underactive or structurally deficient in violent offenders. And as we will talk about more and that you've read, that this prefrontal cortex is what leads to that lack of structure and more thrill-seeking towards more offending behavior. And this explains why some individuals struggle to regulate their behavior or considered long-term consequences. So they don't use rational choice. Similarly, abnormalities in the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that's tied to fear and empathy, are associated with a lack of remorse, emotional detachment, and a higher likelihood of aggression. Now, another biological factor that Rain emphasizes is low physiological arousal. Many offenders show low resting heart rates and reduced autonomic nervous system activity. This is under arousal. This may drive individuals to seek stimulation, and sometimes this is through risky or aggressive acts. Rain makes it clear, though, that biology alone does not cause crime. Instead, it creates vulnerabilities that, when interacted with environment stressors, can increase the risk of a violence. And you can ignore that last sentence. Sometimes when I have my type opened so that I can I talk to type, and I think that was when I was working on this. Next, Rain turns to genetics. And what these are the different chapters in the very beginning that I didn't require you to read, but that's why I think it's important information that you use. When he talked about genetics, he talked about the twin and adoption studies that revealed that antisocial behavior is moderately heritable, with estimates suggesting 40 to 60% of a variation explained by genetic factors. One of the most widely discussed examples is the MAOA gene. This is sometimes called that warrior gene, and research shows that certain variants of this gene, when combined with severe childhood maltreatment, significantly increases the likelihood of later aggression and violence. Importantly, the gene alone is not enough, but it's the combination of biology and environment that matters. There we go with that combination. Rain calls this interaction neurocriminology, an emerging field that uses genetics, neuroscience, and psychology together to explain crime. The neuroimaging studies reveal that many offenders have abnormalities in the frontal and limbic brain regions that impairs their ability to regulate emotions or anticipate consequences. The main message is that biology creates a predisposition, but it's the environment that determines whether that predisposition is expressed. Now, this information comes out of Rain's Chapter 2, and as I said, I did not require that as reading. You're welcome to go back and read that on your own because it's extremely interesting. Let's talk about the social brain. Rain emphasizes the role of social experiences in shaping the brain. Childhood abuse, neglect, and trauma can literally change brain structures that will shrink the hippocampus and overstimulate the amygdala. This creates long-term problems with emotional regulation and empathy. On the other hand, positive experiences can build resilience. He found that strong parental attachment, enriched learning environments, and supportive communities can buffer those biological risks. The social brain framework underscores that biology and environment are inseparable. Just as biology influences crime, social conditions sculpt the brain in ways that can either encourage or discourage antisocial behavior. He talks about the moral brain. Here, Rain explores how morality has biological underpinnings. Brain scans show that certain regions, such as the prefrontal cortex we talked about, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the amygdala, are central to these moral reasoning and empathy. When these regions function abnormally, individuals may struggle to feel guilt or even understand the harm they cause others. Studies of psychopaths demonstrate that they show reduced emotional responses when imaging moral violations. This suggests that morality is not purely a learned social construct. Rather, he found it's tied to measurable brain processes. The implication here is that the deficits in the moral brain can help explain why some people persist in harmful behavior despite social rules and punishments. Rain then talks about the adolescent brain, and he explains why crime peaks in adolescence. And the adolescent brain, as we talked about, is still developing, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, which is not fully mature until the mid-20s. This is a very powerful research that we're trying to get that into the juvenile justice system and the punishment stage, because as I've talked about before, a juvenile is not fully mature until their mid-20s, and this is because of this prefrontal cortex. The developmental stage makes teens more impulsive, more influenced by peers, and more focused on immediate rewards. This biological immaturity helps explain why teenagers take more risk, why delinquency rates are highest during adolescence. Now, to prevent this means supervision, structure, positive peer groups, and especially critical during this stage. Interventions that target impulse control and provide meaningful alternatives to risk-taking can be highly effective for youth. This is why I reiterate that this needs to be involved in the juvenile justice system. Now, finally, Rain, on the biological side, he examines the biological features of psychopathy. Psychopaths display distinctive neurological patterns. They often have smaller or less active amygdalas, which underlie their lack of fear and sympathy. This is some of the most important information that I believe about psychopaths. Now, reduced connectivity between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex prevents emotions from influence rational decision making. And let me go back. I want to look at where I just said fear and empathy. Empathy is not sympathy. So there's a difference here when we're talking about someone not having empathy. Psychopaths also show abnormal physiological responses, such as reduced startle reflexes, lower skin conductance, even in situations designed to provoke fear. Rain notes that psychopathy is partly hereditary, but also shaped by the environment. So this raises a difficult questions about culpability. If psychopaths are hardwired differently, to what extent should they be held responsible for their actions? And some of the most exciting information, if you do read these chapters, I'm not sure where he states it, but he actually went through this testing himself, Rain, and found that he had some of these same elements, as well as his brain structure, and found out that he himself is actually a psychopath. But not a psychopath doesn't automatically mean you're violent. A psychopath is just someone that has the lack of fear and empathy. Rain has children, and he loves his children. He talks about that. He cares for his children, but he remembers things as when he was a teenager, that something would happen to somebody and he thought it was funny. A kid would fall over in the class and get hurt, and he laughed at it. He laughed at it when I think he has an example of kids throwing baseballs through someone's windows, and he thought it was funny. He did not see, he just didn't have that empathy to understand the consequence. But so my main point of this is not all psychopaths are violent. Now, there are a lot of violent people who are diagnosed as psychopaths. So that's just something to put in your notes in somewhere. Just the last little bit on his chapters on biology, that Rain presents a powerful case for understanding crime as the product of biosocial interaction. Biological vulnerabilities, whether in brain structures, genes, or physiology, create certain predispositions, but it is the environment from childhood experiences to social structures that really determines whether those predispositions result in crime. The key takeaway is balance. Biology matters, but it does not dictate destiny. Rain's neurocriminology provides us with tools to better understand offenders, but it also challenges us to think carefully about policy, ethics, and responsibility. This is why I feel so strongly that this information needs to be used to determine and assess juveniles. It also should be used in the sentencing process as well as in the pretrial processes. Now we're going to talk more specifically about biosocial theories. This information is from Akers and Sellers and Jennings, and they discuss some of the same information that Rain did, but I don't want to expand on it because I just did. So they found some of the same information from others' research. Now here's the findings from that BJ research, and this is within your textbook. So I encourage you to take a look at that. This is from Dr. Kevin Beavers. Now, talking about the biosocial approaches again, a lot of this information that is in the Akers book resembles what we just talked about with Rain. But as I said, Rain actually conducted these experiments and this research himself. But the approaches we're talking about focus not just on biology, as I said, but on biosocial interaction. First, they talked about genetics as well, that twin and adoption studies show antisocial behavior is moderately heritable. But genes are not destiny, that we just talked about. They provide predispositions that may or may not be expressed depending on the environment. Second, they talk about neurobiology. And they have research that's linked that frontal lobe dysfunction to poor impulse control and low arousal of the autonomic nervous system to sensation-seeking behaviors. In addition, as Rain found and studied, neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine can influence aggression and reward seeking. Now, thirdly, they talked about hormones, that testosterone is modestly associated with aggression, while cortisol is linked to stress regulation. Now again, these are not causal on their own, but they interact with context. And finally, in Akers' book, they talk about the evolutionary perspectives that argue that risk-taking may have been adaptive in some environments, but becomes maladaptive in modern society. And here again, in the Akers textbook, they reported that one of the most important findings in biosocial criminology is that gene-environment interaction that Rain talks about. The MAOA gene that we just talked about, combined with the childhood maltreatment, is strongly linked to later violent behavior. But without that maltreatment, the same gene variant does not predict offending. Now, this shows how biology sets a potential, but environment determines the outcome. And one thing I want to mention here that I don't think I've covered, we're talking about child maltreatment, and Rain talks about this as well in his book, that this is what impacts biology. If a child receives maltreatment, does not visit the doctor regularly, doesn't take their vitamins, doesn't get their immunizations, they could, and even if they're abused, neglected, all of that can link to their biology and their biological makeup. It can be a negative effect. And so that itself, linked with their environment, can cause to lead to these behaviors. Now, it's important whenever we're talking about juveniles, we always compare to adult offending, as well as you see in some of my discussion questions. Excuse me. Juveniles, they have the impulsivity and sensation seeking that's amplified by that immature brain development. Peer influence and risk-taking is stronger in adolescence. With adults, their biological risks remain, but their behavior stabilizes that. That chronic offending often reflects long-term bioenvironment interactions. And this is what we talked about earlier about the big difference, that when we look at adolescents, we're looking at, and as well as adult offending, but it's the long-term bioenvironment interactions. Like I said, it's children that are malnourished, those that have been abused, those that have been neglected, have medical issues. These, along with their environment and the interactions they receive there, can lead to this chronic offending. Now, Akers, Sellers, and Jennings, they also discussed how prevention and early intervention, along with nutrition, parental support, and structured environments, can help reduce the chance of this violent behavior. The cognitive behavioral programs that teach self-control and anger management, environmental design, lighting, guardianship to reduce the opportunities for crime, and that biology should supplement, not replace, social policy. Towards the conclusion of what the Akers talked about, is that the biological and biosocial theories explain the variation beyond sociological perspectives. It shows why some offend while others in the same environment do not. That's important right here because you have that in one of your assignments. It's probabilistic, not deterministic. It's best understood when integrated with social explanations.